You're listening to New Youth Radio, a show about global culture and local youth.
Welcome to our show. That was a track by Susan Ferouz, who's often called Afghanistan's first female rapper and a voice for women's rights and political consciousness. She's 23 and lives in Kabul after returning 7 years ago. Her lyrics talk about being displaced and the hardships and discrimination so many Afghans faced in other countries. She's one of many Afghan women working to highlight poverty, women's rights, refugees' rights, and the effects of war in her country. Performed in Dari, her lyrics narrate life as a refugee dreaming of her homeland. She is also part of a generation, many born outside of Afghanistan, who are dedicated to rebuilding a country and a consciousness through their words and images. One such artist is Afghan Canadian filmmaker Ariel Nasr. He directed Good Morning Kandahar and The Boxing Girls of Kabul for the National Film Board of Canada and is currently creating an NFB interactive project about storytellers in Kabul. He also co-founded 2 organizations to help train and promote Afghan filmmakers. We had the great pleasure of interviewing him when his film, The Boxing Girls of Kabul, screened in Guelph recently.
Ariel, my name is Donya, and I work at Immigrant Services as the community mobilizer. I work on 3 different projects that have programming for adult and youth newcomers and immigrants. And I'm of Serbian background, and I came to Canada when I was 7.
Hi, Ariel. This is Fariel. I also work in Immigrant Services at the Administration Assistant, and I'm also from Afghanistan. I came here 11 years ago, so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. Well, I was born in Halifax, actually. I was born to an Afghan father and American mother, so a child of 2 immigrants, first generation born here in Canada. But I knew a lot about America because we used to go there when I was a kid, but I didn't know too much about Afghanistan because my father didn't want to go back until the war was over. And as you know, the war never really ended to the point where it was safe to go. So it wasn't until I graduated from college that I finally went back to Afghanistan. And that was also when I started making films. So for me, making films and visiting Afghanistan were always kind of tied closely together. It was the place I was the most fascinated with, and filmmaking was what I wanted to do. So I kind of learned how to make films in Afghanistan, and that's what I was doing when I first went to my father's country. So I have an interesting relationship with the country and with my own identity, which has changed over the years as I've spent more and more time in Afghanistan, and so that's a little bit about me.
How has spending all that time in Afghanistan shaped your identity or your notions of how your identity continues to evolve?
Well, it's funny. I think it's actually made it a little bit looser, a little bit more free-flowing, because when I was young, ironically, I'd never been to Afghanistan, but I really had this identity of being an Afghan Canadian. It was something that I clung to. And I went there and I realized that I really wasn't very Afghan at all. Culturally, I was really more Canadian. And then eventually I moved there for a few years and came back. But I'd never really felt 100% Canadian either. So, you know, in the end, I think the more time I spent there, the more I kind of accepted that I didn't have to nail down my identity to a set of labels. So I didn't have to decide to be Canadian or decide to be Afghan, or even Afghan Canadian maybe doesn't fit. And then I was kind of okay with that, you know, that I would just let it be something that is always going to be a bit of a mystery, you know, and always going to be something that's gradually changing. I think for a lot of us, people like me, who are born in a country but don't feel necessarily 100% at home there because have a new kind of identity, part of a sort of maybe a new generation of people whose parents are from all over the world or who have cross-cultural identity. We're kind of okay with that. We can relax into something that's a little bit more complex, and I like that idea.
I think that's something all of us can relate to in the studio.
So, what type of documentaries really inspire you the most?
Well, documentaries that inspired me the most when I was really watching a lot of documentaries probably started when I was in college, out east at University of King's College. I think those documentaries that inspired me were always documentaries about other cultures, and whether it be overseas or something right next door, or you know, a different culture that exists in your own neighborhood, you know, those documentaries that showed you that there's that commonality between people despite their differences. That's what I always loved. I loved the kind of going into unfamiliar territory and finding a way through it. One documentary that inspired me a lot was Iraq in Fragments, and it's about Iraq, and incredibly visual. It takes you almost on a tour of the country and showing you without voiceover or without too much of a narrative guide. It just shows you what the place looks and feels like, and that was inspiring for me. I wanted to do that in Afghanistan as well, and I've tried to kind of carry a little bit of that with me when I do my own work, to try and create bridges for people visually so they can feel a little bit what it's like to live in Afghanistan when they watch my films.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Boxing Girls of Kabul?
Yes. Boxing Girls of Kabul is a film that I started making, I think I started researching in 2007 or 8. I originally came across an article about these women who had started to box in Afghanistan, and I was immediately fascinated. I wanted to know more. So I tracked down their organization that had started the team, and I talked to the executive director. His name is Kanishka Nawabi, and he was very encouraging. Now, at that time, they were a small project called Fight for Peace, and they did peace training initiatives. So they would, apart from boxing, they also were doing workshops about how to build peace in their communities and this kind of stuff. And so I conceived of this documentary that was really about that. It was about these young women who were learning how to build peace in their neighborhoods, partly through this exercise of learning how to box. But by the time that I got to Afghanistan to make the film, they had turned into the national boxing team of Afghanistan. They had found their way to the gym in the National Stadium, and they've been sanctioned by the Olympic Committee. So they were a different animal, and it was really much more about boxing. For me, though, I tried to keep the focus different from that because I didn't want it to become too much a film about boxing. For me, it was always about, these women who had a great deal of hope and were in a new environment, testing the limits of what they could do and how far they could push their freedom and how they could make a difference. So that was what it was about. And I guess my goal with the film was to just have people in Canada, and now it's really done very well internationally. So, I think it's applicable all over the world, that to look and see just for an hour what kind of lives women live in Kabul. And this is a very unusual group of women. But I guess I wanted to say, okay, even with these women whose families allow them to go to a boxing school, even with these women, let's see what are the limits on their freedom. People always ask me these questions, like, are women in Afghanistan free? And it's not a yes or no answer, of course. So I just wanted to kind of add a little bit of complexity to the debate about women's rights in Afghanistan by showing these women in the capital who are sort of pushing as far as they can to show people a little bit more of a complicated answer to the question of women's rights and women's freedoms.
Now, speaking of your movie, while you were directing this movie, did you face some challenges, especially when you were talking about women and, these girls boxing? Did you notice any specific challenges while you're making the movie?
Oh, yeah. There were some challenges for sure. Yeah. I mean, you can imagine some of the challenges, I'm sure, right? Because you guys know about some of these issues around women in Afghanistan. And so obviously one of the big ones when it comes to filming, there's some cultural problems with women showing themselves in public and doing something physical like that. So what I'm getting at is the problem of access, essentially. There's some really heavy cultural restrictions that we had to work around. Now, the thing is with these women, and this is one of the benefits of working on a story about sports, is that if sport is already a form of entertainment, sport is already a public thing if you're talking about a national team. So they already had a fair bit of media attention on them from the domestic media, TV, news clips, this kinds of stuff. So that was good because it got that initial question of whether they should be filmed at all. It kind of got that out of the way. So the question was then, how much access would I be allowed? They really became partners in making the film with me. So I really didn't take any shortcuts at all because the time frame of the film had to be filmed over more than a year. So little by little, I got to know the team. I started by just visiting them, seeing what they needed, seeing how I could help, helping them find donors, this kind of stuff. And I met their families, and little by little I explained who I was and got them used to the idea of the National Film Board, what it is that the National Film Board of Canada does in terms of socially relevant documentaries, the fact that I wasn't going to make a profit on their film other than the salary that I was being paid, things that are really important to kind of let them know because, of course, there's a kind of trust deficit in Afghanistan right now because there's been so much corruption and so much dishonesty perpetrated both by domestic and international individuals and organizations. So, it just was a slow process. And that was the hardest thing. And because of that lack of trust, sometimes I would have to sort of start over again. Because if, as happened one time, some foreign journalists were there and they sort of broke the rules of what they were allowed to do in terms of taking pictures or publishing pictures without permission, then that affected me too. So at one point we lost our access because there was such a large number of photographers visiting the gym that some of the parents started to say, well, why, we're not sending our girls to a fashion shoot here, like we're sending them to practice a sport, and we have given some permission to some media, but we don't give permission for everyone to just walk in the gym. And so I had to then start because they got so worried that they cut off all media access, and I had to start over at that point. So, I mean, of course, you kind of imagine a more dramatic dangers from being in Afghanistan, and there were those. There were bombings in Kabul while I was there. There were physical dangers. There were some traumatic events that happened to me. Those actually weren't really part of making this film in particular. They were more hazards of living in Kabul. So as far as making this film, really the biggest challenge was to keeping those lines of communication open at all times and just having to be so conscious and careful about how I was communicating to make sure that we kept the access and were able to finish the film.
In terms of the relationship between the coach and the women that he was coaching, was this his first time coaching a women's boxing team?
Well, it is, and this is actually one of the first and only boxing teams in Afghanistan. Now, there's some smaller teams in other parts of the country, but they're not meeting as consistently, and this is the first, actually, this one. So, and they're actually in Kabul City, there's actually another group of women who gather together to box, but they're not a team in the sense that they don't compete in the same way that this team does. So this is pretty much it. So yes, this is the first time he's coached a women's boxing team. He looks pretty natural at it though, doesn't he?
Now, why do you think it's boxing that's really brought these women together? Why not another sport?
That's a good question. What do you think? I mean, it has some kind of visceral appeal, I think, on a gut level when you think about people who have been displaced a lot, people who have been forced to leave their homes, young people whose lives have been difficult. I think boxing has a certain visceral appeal, at least for a viewer, in terms of the story and the narrative. It seems to make sense, and I think it probably makes sense in their lives as well, that they have some outlet, and it could be any other sport, but boxing, I think, is probably a particularly good one because it's so intense, and it really is a kind of symbolic kind of one-on-one battle where a lot of bravery is required, a lot of courage is required. I think there's two answers. I think on the one hand, boxing is a little bit au courant right now. It's like what people are doing. It's an exciting sport. If you look at films about boxing, there's been an explosion in the last year or two. It's a sport that for women is new, not just in Afghanistan, but all over the world. So people are excited about it, and that's probably why the team got started. These women have been through a lot. They have a lot of emotion around doing a sport for the first time. So it's interesting that boxing is a sport that really puts them on the spot, tests their courage. It's like a real test of physical bravery. So that's one of the things about it anyway that fascinated me.
Now let's talk a little bit about your previous documentaries. You picked some really great topics, I must say. Like you picked, your documentaries are like Good Morning Kandahar and Buzkashi Boys. These are really some great topics that you picked. Does something inspired you? Did you really wanted to know about them, or it just came to me and you said, let's do this documentary? No,
yeah, definitely. These are films that followed my own curiosity. Good Morning Kandahar, and Buzkashi Boys are very different, but I think that there's a kind of progression and before Good Morning Kandahar, I made a film called My Father's Foreign Country. And that was also about Afghanistan. They're all really related to Afghanistan. And I think if I look back on those films, it sort of reflects my growth as a filmmaker, but also as an Afghan, because, really started close to home, investigating sort of some of the issues around my father and my complicated family. And then with Good Morning Kandahar, I made a film about Afghan Canadians who were living in Canada and feeling some internal conflict because of the conflict in their home country where Canada was fighting. So that was about that, and that was what I was feeling at the time. And then I wanted to make a film about Afghans who had never left Afghanistan or who were still there dealing with the situation. So that was Boxing Girls. And after that, I produced this narrative film, which is fictional, actually. It was Buzkashi Boys. And that's about these young men who are chasing their dreams and have to come to terms with reality in Afghanistan. I think for me, because it was a fictional story, that was yet another level of being able to dig into this really rich subject matter for me of Afghanistan and see where I could take it. So it's just kind of been a journey for me of getting to know the country as I get to know filmmaking. I think probably I'll make some films that aren't about Afghanistan, but maybe not for a while yet, because I've got a couple more coming that are also about that country.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about how broadcasting and radio features in Good Morning Kandahar?
In Good Morning Kandahar, there's of the title of the film reflects one of the subjects who works in a Canadian military radio station that broadcasts from Kingston into Kandahar, Afghanistan. Kingston, Ontario to Kandahar, Afghanistan. So what they're doing is they're broadcasting soft propaganda into Kandahar. So the idea, and this radio station has since been shut down, but at the time was the peak of Canada's effort in Kandahar. And so they were trying to provide an alternative to the media that the Taliban was broadcasting in the same region. So it was kind of what you call soft propaganda. So it was more just kind of an alternative. So Hindi music and so Pashto music and some beauty tips, health tips, information about other countries, anything to just kind of keep people preoccupied and give them a little bit of optimism about the international project there. But I think also it was then, of course, a way that they could then, once they earned their listeners, they could start doing some messaging around, public service announcements, how to behave around convoys, how to, what to do if you spot someone placing an IED. So it was interesting to me because what did these Afghans feel? I wanted to get into what they felt about this. How was there not a conflict for them? Because after all, Canada was at war in their country. And I think that as a metaphor, it was useful for me as a filmmaker too, because you had these young men and women whose voices were actually being broadcast back in their homeland, but they were physically sitting in Canada, so that sense of displacement was palpable. That was that aspect of the film. And then, of course, there was a woman who was an activist who had also been the chief of a radio station in Afghanistan. And I wanted to show her as a kind of counterpoint or foil to these other young men and women, because she was a very professional broadcaster who had to leave Afghanistan when her life was threatened, and she was staying in Canada on a refugee claim. She, Nadia Hanifi, was strongly opposed to the war, so she provided a counterpoint to these young men and women who were working within the war effort. As she said, her opinion was that though Afghanistan did need foreign aid and even military aid and training, she believed very strongly that foreign troops should not be there. So it was part of the debate at the time of whether or not Canada should be in Afghanistan, a debate that obviously now is less relevant because we've finished that military sort of combat part of our operations in Kandahar and reduced now down to just the training force.
I'm most interested in, and I don't know if this is kind of your next step as well, is the idea of what identity is evolving into in terms of an Afghan Canadian identity that is being defined by the next generation. The experience is very rich, and sometimes I feel as though that is not necessarily given voice to here and now in our community. Is that something that you kind of are interested in exploring?
It's a very, very good question, very interesting. But I don't know as much about that as you guys do. I mean, to be honest with you, I grew up in a community where I was really the only young Afghan Canadian. We had cousins who we were sponsoring at the time from Afghanistan. They would come through, and then they tended to move further west where there were larger Afghan communities, because I was born in Halifax, which had a very negligibly small, tiny Afghan community. So it was really my father, and then as they would come through once in a while, our cousins. So for me, the experience of being a young Afghan Canadian was isolation. I mean, it was about this identity that was only really me and my little brother, and sister as they were born, and my other sisters, my half sisters when they were born. So I don't share the same experience. I'm actually curious myself. But in Good Morning Kandahar, that's one of the things that I explored, and it was interesting because I was exploring it a little bit as an outsider, a little bit as an insider, because I had the common ancestry, and I had some shared experience, but I was also an outsider because I didn't grow up in a community of young Afghans. So I've always been a little bit curious about that myself.
I just want to say it was really honor, and I was really inspired by you that you traveled back home and you visited these people and you made these movies. Actually, I never knew about this until now, and now from from now on, I will like watch your movies. And in fact, last
good.
night I went to the store and to get your movies, which is amazing. So thank you so much for doing that. And that's
thank
all
you
I want
so
to say.
much.
Thank you for taking the time, and you are. I wish you all the best for future, and I hope you be successful and bring more movies for us and entertain us and really show this through the story that comes, because it's not just about the war, but there's actually the beauty side of it. Like, I know about this, but a lot of people don't know about it. And when I'm in a community, I talk about it, but I really don't have the power to talk about it too much to the people. Like, I don't have to talk about it in the media, but I think what you're doing is amazing, because you are actually going there, you're exploring the stuff, but at the same time, you're bringing to the people, and that's amazing. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks so much. No, it's very, very nice to talk to you today. I'm really happy we could do this.
We're going to end the show with another Afghan Canadian, Majda Jamaljada, who has risen to celebrity status in Afghanistan. Unlike Ariel, she's used to being in front of the camera, and I would hazard a guess is a little more glamorous as well. Majda fled Afghanistan with her family when she was 5 and grew up in Vancouver. She moved back to Kabul a few years ago, where she hosted her own talk show and is also quite well known for her work on women's rights. Here she is now singing a cover of Those Were the Days in both English and Dari.